Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back. This is Mr. Math. Last time we went over openings for white for beginners, and this time we're going to be grading all of black's options for openings. Similarly to last time, I will be grading on a scale from A to F, where A is the best and F is the worst. Again, just like last video, this video will not be like a traditional lecture. So again, we won't be going over puzzles and whatnot. That will be gone over next time. We do a more traditional lecture, which should be next video. As for how we're going to grade, we've got three categories that I'm going to be grading on, and I'm going to be taking an approximate average of those. We have learnability, which is how easy is this for a new player to learn? Are there a lot of variations to go over or just one? The next is going to be frequency. How often are you going to see this during a game? How reliably can you get to play this opening during the game? Right? Because if a opening is extremely rare, then chances are it won't be worth learning. And finally, is solidity. How good is this opening? Is there a well-known refutation to the opening? Is this opening, if you put it in a computer, is the computer going to tell you that this opening is good, or is it going to tell you that there is a line your opponent can play which will cause you to lose a knight? Right. So those are the three categories we're going to be grading this on. And of course, like before, this is primarily aimed at beginners. This is meant to be an opening, just like the last video, opening video for beginners to learn, decide what the best openings for them to pick up should be. Also, like last video, I might not be able to get to every single opening, both for time reasons, and because the format I'm using on Tier Maker doesn't necessarily include every opening. So if there's a particular opening that you want to see, check the description in the comments if I've posted something there. If not, feel free to post a comment and I will reply as quickly as possible with what I think about the opening and what I would grade it with, assuming it's not in here. And finally, we'll be going, just like in the previous video, from F to A. So we'll be starting with the worst of the worst and we'll be moving our way up to the best of the best. Additionally, you may have noticed that the layout is slightly different, and that's because I swapped to a new laptop, which has a different resolution. And so some of the relative scales of things might be a little bit different because I had to move and change some things around on my layout. And hopefully it is similar enough to the previous layout that you don't mind. And with that, just like last video, we're getting started with that's right, it's the bomb cloud. And once again, it's going right into the bottom of F tier. Uh, we are grading off of whether or not you should actually learn it, not whether or not it is a good joke or a good meme. And so unfortunately, bomb cloud's going straight into F, mainly because of the issue of solidity. So if you don't know what it is, you should be very grateful and you should probably look away. But now here's the bomb cloud. It's E4. Now black is going to respond with E6 or E5 to, I believe, E6 is more official. And then on the next move, black is planning, let's say white goes D4. It doesn't really matter too much what white does. Black is planning to make the move King E7. And of course, this is a ridiculous move. Black is blocking in all of their own pieces and denying their right to castle. It's a good joke, and it's a good joke precisely because it is so terrible. And as you can see, solidity is an F. Because of that, frequency is technically an A. Like, sure, you can get this every game. Although, uh, I'm not sure you want to. And so, yeah, as for learnability, again, for the same reason as I said in the last video for Bon Cloud, as white, learnability isn't that high, even though frequency is high. And that's because it's very hard to figure out what you're supposed to do as black here. There is no one thing you can do over and over again. You really have to adapt to white's plans because you're putting yourself in such a terrible position. And so, yeah, Bon Cloud, I cannot recommend it. It's going into F tier. Next up in F tier is the Dura's Gambit, also known as the Fred, which goes e4, and now the extremely dubious move of f5, gambiting the pawn on the f file in the hope that white will take and get rid of their own central pawn. And of course, the immediate problem with this is that after e takes f5, d5, white immediately has queen h5, and your king is under attack. Obviously, you don't want to move it to d7, but after g6, pawn takes g7, you're in a pickle because white is threatening discover check in two different ways, and of course, neither way of defending is satisfactory. Uh, or rather, there is no satisfactory way of defending, I should say. Whereas king d7 is still unsatisfactory. After knight f6, there's actually g7 check, and it doesn't matter that you can take white's queen. They're going to make a new one on h8. Um, and of course, the other main method would be bishop g7, pawn takes h7, king f8. But of course, you're losing the knight now with check. And this is also very, very bad. Of course, black doesn't have to do this. And instead, I believe the main response now after e takes f5 is and should be knight f6 to stop queen h5. This is still very bad. You're opening up that king's diagonal for no good reason. White is going to have solid control of the e5 square, which is the biggest problem with this. I can just play d4 and bishop d3 on the next two turns, and is going to have a very, very fun game since you gave them a free pawn and then actually got a worse position because this f5 pawn turns out still does function in controlling the center because you don't currently have a pawn on e4, right? Or on e5, sorry. This is not like the King's Gambit where you already have the pawn out. In this case, you don't have an extra central pawn that you would normally have because you're playing black and you went second. And so the Duras Gambit, also known as Fred, is getting the exact same scores as the Bong Cloud. Solidity F, learnability C, frequency A, for the same reasons really listed in the Bong Cloud. And it's the next contender in F tier. Next up in F tier is the martial attack, which goes with the following moves. We have e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Now bishop b5, which is the Roy Lopez. Black now plays a6 to kick the bishop to a7. There is knight f6, castle kingside. Bishop e7 is now played. Or sorry, castle kingside didn't go through correctly. Bishop e7, rook e1, b5, kicking the bishop. After bishop b3 now, there's castles c3, and now d5. And this is the Marshall Gambit. Play may continue. E takes d5. Knight captures d5. Uh, Now knight takes e5. Knight takes. Sorry, I didn't castle correctly for black either. Knight takes e5. Knight takes c5. Rook takes e5. And now pawn to c6. And black's idea is, let's say d4 for white, trying to bring the pieces out. But of course, black is going to beat them to the punch with bishop d6, rook e1, and queen h4. So this is the Marshall Gambit. Black sacrificed a pawn on the d file, or arguably on the e file, in order to get fast development and a good deal of pressure on white's king. And at the Grandmaster level, this has been calculated to be a draw in most circumstances, which is why it is a solidity of A. Black getting the initiative is really not something that white wants to happen. And so what happens at the Grandmaster level is that players will actively try and avoid the martial attack by not playing the specific sequence of moves. And that's how scary it can be. And of course, the martial attack is very strong when you get to it. If white does not know how to defend perfectly, they can and will lose the game. But it's still getting a grade of F, and the Marshall Gambit's a great example of why it's not good to rate an opening based on solidity alone, because both learnability and frequency I'm giving an F here. This is a ridiculous number of moves. This is 8 moves to get to the main line, and then 2 more moves to get to this position, which is the continuation of the main line. The martial attack is not something that beginners can learn with any degree of success. It's just too complicated, it's too long, and what are the chances your opponent's going to follow this exact move sequence? Almost zero. And that's why the martial attack, despite its very powerful, despite the fact it's a very powerful opening and solidity, I am giving an A. The other two categories are Fs, and that's why it's going into F as well. And now we're out of the F tier and we're on to the first opening that I'm going to be rating a C for black, and that's the Hippo. And the Hippo, of course, is a setup opening where no matter what white does, you're going to move the pawns to e6 and d6, pawns to b6 and g6. You're going to fianchetto your bishops, move your knights up, and this is the general setup of the hippo. Now you may push other pawns up depending on how you want to play from here, and move your queen up and castle your king whichever direction you please. This is the general idea of the hippo, and you may be confused if you watched my previous video, why is the hippo getting a C when I rated it an F for white? And that's simply because I rated it an F for white in terms of solidity, whereas I'm giving it a C here because the reason why the hippo was an F and solidity for white is because white has no reason to try and give up the center like this. White generally, because you have that first move advantage, you're going to be the side that's taking control of the center, taking control of the game. Whereas black is the one trying to counter attack. A lot of black's openings that are very successful, including, for example, the Grunfeld opening, involve giving your opponent the center and then striking back later. And that can be done with the hippo. And the hippo does allow for black to play something like f5 or c5 and break open the center at some point. Let's say white gets pawns on e4, d4, and let's say develop their knights and their bishops. Black has some nasty looking pawn breaks that can be played at some point. And yeah, black is not completely hopeless here. Now, of course, I'm still giving it a low tier rating. Anyone who has played for any amount of time understands that it was not very good. It's basically just a worse version of the King's Indian defense, which we will be going over later. Um, and if you want to play the style of playing setup chess, developing slowly, letting your opponent take the center and then striking back, you should play the King's Indian defense instead. As for the hippo, yeah, you should not be playing this. It's too slow. You make too many pawn moves in the opening, and it's not going to go well against anyone who has any idea of how to play against it. Also going into C is going to be the Latvian gambit, which goes e4, e5, knight f3, and now f5. And as you'll probably notice, this is similar to the Dura's gambit with the exception that black already has a pawn on e5. And so after e takes f5, the idea is that now black can play e4 and grab control of the center. The Latvian gambit is very, very dubious. And the main problem with it is going to be that actually not even the solidity. Solidity is a secondary problem. Learnability is the real problem here. White has just way too many responses, many of which are very threatening. Not only can white accept the gambit with e takes f5, they can also play knight takes e5, since after knight takes e5, you cannot capture the pawn on e4 because of queen h5 check. And if g6, there is knight takes g6 because there's a pin, as well as a4, both of which will win your rook. And so Latvian Gambit, very, very dangerous, and that's not even considering all of the other lines white can play. There's bishop c4, which is very heavily analyzed, and also very dangerous. White can also play something like d4 or knight c3 as well. And of course, if white wants to be very safe, they can play d3, and you will get no real advantage. And so the Latvian Gambit is really not recommended. Learnability is too low, in my opinion, to be justifiable. However, if you're really into it, it can be a fun option, and I will put it into C tier instead of F. And that brings us into the category B tier, which is where we're going to go over our first viable openings and the ones I would recommend for players who are not scared of a challenge or just simply find it interesting. These openings, uh, unlike their C and D counterparts, are going to be viable, but they're going to have one or two key weaknesses that makes me not recommend them for completely new beginners, or if you find any other opening equally attractive in the A tier, I'm going to recommend those instead. So let's begin with our first opening in the B category, which is going to be the Dutch defense, which I'm giving a B for solidity, a B for learnability, and an A for frequency. And the Dutch defense is quite simple. It's d4, and now f5. This is the Dutch defense. And the idea is to challenge white's control of e4 using a side pawn instead of with the more traditional method of d5 with the center pawn. And the Dutch defense is perfectly fine, actually. It's fairly solid. Of course, there are going to be inherent dangers associated with moving your pawn, your f pawn, as any beginner knows. And in fact, one of the more dangerous lines that can happen here, for example, is pawn to e5, sacrificing a pawn for white, and now after f takes e4, sorry, pawn to e4, and now after f takes e4, white has a myriad of options, knight c3 being, or c4, stuff like that. But perhaps most interesting is going to be queen h5, which is of course not particularly good. But after pawn to g6, you're going to have to watch out because after, so let's say, bishop e2, you cannot capture the queen because if g takes h5, bishop takes h5 is checkmate. And so, of course, the Dutch defense has its fair of share of traps, as do any openings where you move the f pawn, and that's why I'm gonna put the learnability down to B instead of A. Frequencies in A, because yes, you can just play f5 on the first move, and solidity is a B, because while it is solid, the number of traps you have to avoid is going to be a problem. And as for the general game plan, it's okay, but I do think it's slightly inferior to most answers to d4. Most ideas involve moving the knight out to f6, grabbing control of these light squares. Sometimes you fianchetto the bishop, sometimes you fianchetto the other bishop and play it sort of like a closed Sicilian or a Queen's Indian, rather. So, you know, your black has a lot of decent options here. But at the end of the day, it's a little hard to learn, in my opinion, compared to some of the other openings you can learn. And it's a little less solid than you would probably like. And next up in B is going to be the Budapest Gambit, which similarly starts with d4. Now after knight f6, and white plays the Queen's Gambit with c4. Now black plays e5, sacrificing the pawn on the e-file. And after d takes e5, the main idea is now knight g4, re-attacking the pawn on e5. And the Budapest Gambit is fairly solid, but it has a couple issues. It's actually mainly playing for traps at the beginner level. One example, for example, is if white gets a little too preoccupied with trying to keep things solid, let's say with knight f3, now we have knight c6, bishop f4, and now black can play bishop b4 check. White's only response to keep the pawn is going to be knight b d2 after queen e7. Adding a third attacker to the pawn, white may attempt to counterattack with, say, a3. And now there is the cool idea knight takes e5, which looks like it just gives up the bishop. But after a takes b4, of course, black now utilizes the fact that were it not for the black knight being here, there would be a pin on the e2 pawn. And so, of course, black can play knight d3 checkmate, because the pawn cannot capture the knight and the king is smothered. And so this is not the only trap in the Budapest Gambit, and the combination of traps for black does mean that usually black recovers the pawn. Unfortunately for black, it typically happens with some sort of positional disadvantage, and that's why I'm gonna say solidity B for the Budapest Gambit. You also have to know all of the traps, and that's the other big problem. White often can dodge the traps even, and if they do, they're going to end up with something like a Marzi bind with pawns on e4 and c4, and they're going to have stronger control over the center. And black is going to have problems because they're wasting a bunch of time with their knights, going to f6 to g4 to e5 in order to capture these pawns. And so, for those reasons, Budapest Gambit, although it's quite an interesting gambit, is going to go into a B tier. And next up is going to be the Benoni defense, which now goes after d4, knight f6, c4. Instead of playing e5 to sacrifice the e pawn, it's c5 to sacrifice the c pawn. Of course, similarly to the Budapest, it's not too much of a sacrifice. If white were to capture d takes c5, this c pawn is nigh impossible to hold on to. Black's bishop or queen can very quickly capture it, as well as black's knight if it chooses to hop to a6, which also has the added benefit of stopping pawn to b4. So of course, white usually does not take, and has a couple options, mainly e3 and d5. d5 is the most challenging one, as it thrusts a pawn far into black's position, and it's for this line reason that I'm going to give it a solidity of B. Benoni has some problems at the high rating, which is mainly that it's going to give black some positional spatial issues with regards if you play the standard Benoni with d6 and g6, or if you play the old Benoni, which is e6 and attempting to trade the pawns off. Learnability is also a B because of the multiple aforementioned lines, and frequency is also a B because your opponent has to be playing d4 and c4. Now, if you choose to combine the Benoni with the Banco Gambit, which is now b5, I do think that actually makes it a lot better, and it sidesteps a lot of the solidity issues, in my opinion. Banco Gambit is a very, very powerful opening where you gambit this pawn on the side and you gambit another one. And the idea is black is going to get far better development and is going to have open files and the B and A files to attack with. However, in my opinion, it's not worth learning all these lines, and there are similar openings with similar strategies, hint hint, King's Indian defense, that we'll be going over later that I think are better to learn. Next up is going to be the French defense. The French defense goes e4, black replies now e6, which is the main move, and now after d4, d5, trying to use this e-pawn to support the d-pawn to challenge white's center. And now there are a couple different variations. We have knight c3 and knight d2 as the two possible knight moves, and then there's also e4, or sorry, e5, which is the advanced French, and the exchange French, which is e takes d5, e takes d5. And because you're giving white all these options, learnability is going to be a B. You're going to have to do something different for each one of those things white can play. Frequency is also a B because, of course, your opponent could play d4, and then instead of e4, they could play c4. And this is what I play in tournaments, in fact, Queen's Gambit. And of course, now if you play d5, your opponent is very happy to exchange a side pawn for a center pawn. And so the French cannot really be played in that scenario. Solidity is also a B. While the French defense is reasonably solid for the most part, it does typically have issues, especially after knight c3 or e5. We can look at e5 as an example, mainly with regards to the c8 bishop, which is going to be a very, very sad bishop for the most of the game because it's going to be blocked off by its own pawns and it really can't do anything. Black actually has a problem with both of his bishops usually. The other bishop can't go to that many places either. White often places a pawn at c3, and as you can see, black's bishop is not going to have bishops are both not going to have too many options, and it's a symptom of playing too passively with e6 and d5, and giving white all of this extra space, and black being very, very cramped. And while black does have some pawn pushes, it's not enough, in my opinion, to make this playable at the beginner level, which is why I'm giving a French defense a B. Next up in B is going to be the Grunfeld defense, which goes d4, knight f6, c4, and now black plays g6, knight c3 before playing d5. And the idea is that now white is incentivized to play c takes d5, knight takes d5, e4, knight takes c3, b takes c3. And black is now going to play bishop g7. And white does get a center wall of pawns, but as you may know, if you looked at some of the previous lectures, this was a position I posted as a puzzle as to why black is not disadvantaged here. And the main reason is this fianchettoed bishop gives black a surprising amount of control over the center, despite not having any pawns physically in the center. And black's plans are quite simple and quite efficient from now on. Mainly, they revolve around using the fact that there's a pin on the pawn on c3, as well as eventually when the queen moves away. So let's say now white plays bishop e3, queen a5 would attack the c3 pawn as well, and then rook d8 is going to also pin the d4 pawn to the queen, and black can finish their pressure with knight c6, adding another attacker and bishop g4. And eventually this center cannot stand. Black simply will have too many attackers on it. And so white is not going to be able to retain that central control advantage for very, very long. Therefore, because the plan is so simple, you can really play this in any line in the Grunfeld. I'm giving learnability an A, but I'm dropping frequency to a C, because you may have noticed it took a lot of moves to get to that, right? After your opponent had to play d4, opponent had to play the Queen's Gambit, your opponent had to, uh, opponent had to capture on d5, right? They don't really have to do that. Opponent had to play e4. Again, they also don't really have to do that. So frequency is going to be a C because you're not necessarily going to get the dream Grunfeld position every single time. But once you do, it is pretty easy to learn what to do from there because the plan is mainly the same. Just simply attack the d4 pawn, right? And attack your opponent's center. It's quite a simple game plan, and it's quite an effective one too. The next opening we're going to go over in B is going to be the Najdorf defense, which goes e4, c5, knight f3, and now black plays d6, uh, d4 captures, knight f6, which forces out knight c3, and now a6 to stop white's bishops and knights from going to b5, and potentially push b5 later. Najdorf defense is extremely solid and extremely well studied, played by multiple world champions and top players in general. As with any line in the Sicilian, rather, it is extremely solid and extremely good. The main problem is that it's a lot of moves to get to this position, right? To play specifically the Najdorf, your opponent, for example, could have played the close Sicilian or could have played the Grand Prix instead. And then this game plan really does not work out. And that's why frequency is a C. Learnability is also a B. It's not inherently too obvious what black is supposed to be doing from here. And there are, in fact, a couple different game plans. And so this is not the line I recommend to play in the Sicilian, although of course it is extremely solid. There is another Sicilian line we're going to be going over later that I would recommend instead. The Philidor defense is what we're going over next in B, and it goes as an e4 defense instead. And now the plan is to play the move pawn to e5, knight f3, and now as black's option to defend the e5 pawn, and play d6, defending it with the pawn. The Philidor defense is very solid, except it isn't anymore. It used to be considered fine, but my opinion is that this is far too passive for black, and white gains an immediate advantage after d4. Now black has two main options. Black may either capture on d4, which is the main line, after which black will have problems throughout the game owing to the bishop on f8, which, similar to the French defense, is going to have problems with developing. Alternatively, there is the gambit of f5, but as has been shown throughout history, this is not a very good line, primarily because of knight c3, and white gains a large developmental advantage. It's not easy for black to rectify. And so I don't recommend the Philidor defense too much. It is theoretically solid after it takes d4, knight takes d4 in terms of defense, but it's not very exciting. It's has clear positional problems, and white has multiple ways of attacking you, whereas black has no good game plan to attack back. And so it's difficult to learn because you're mostly just playing defense the whole time, and you have to react to what they're doing instead of having a proactive game plan of your own. Frequency is also a B because, of course, your opponent did not have to play knight f3. The Philidor cannot be played against something like the bishop's opening or against the Vienna. The Portuguese gambit goes into B as well, and it goes e4, d5, which of course is the Scandinavian. And now after e takes d5, of course, black does not recapture and plays knight f6 instead. And now white plays the best move, which is d4, attempting to give back the pawn in exchange for a center after knight takes d5. But the Portuguese gambit is now the following move, playing bishop g4 and insisting on trying to give back the pawn after the line f3, bishop f5, c4, and now white retains the pawn and builds up a large center. From here, there are multiple moves. Black can play e6 or c6 to challenge the position. Most notably, after e6, pawn takes e6. Black actually does not recapture the pawn with either the bishop or the pawn most of the time, and instead opts to develop another piece, looking to take advantage of the fact that up until this point, white has only made pawn moves. And of course, black will have a large developmental advantage. That said, this is not very good for black. If white knows how to defend, first of all, they simply won't take the pawn, and they'll play knight c3 here. And of course, just give back the pawn because white doesn't really need to keep it here. They'll have a decent advantage because their black is wasting some moves here. And secondly, of course, white doesn't even have to enter this at all. For example, instead of f3 here, they could have declined the gambit by playing something like bishop e2 instead. And so the Portuguese gambit is going to give us C in frequency. There are too many sidelines, too many situations where you don't get into it. Learnability and solidity are B though. If you're interested in going into it, It's certainly a fun opening and can get some very aggressive positions with black, but don't expect it to be an opening that you keep throughout your career because the solidity is going to be B for a reason. And our final opening, which is getting a B grade, is going to be the Slav defense, which goes d4, d5, and now white plays the Queen's Gambit with c4, and black declines the Queen's Gambit with pawn to c6, defending the pawn on d5. And from here on, black has a lot of different game plans. For example, they're usually developing knight to f6 and the knight to d7 and playing them with pawn to e6. Black does have to make a choice about whether or not to develop this bishop, and if they do, whether or not it's safe in light of white potentially getting some forks off. Black can also play a6 at some point, with the idea of capturing later and playing b5 to try and hold on to the pawn. And so from this point, there are a lot of different things that you can learn. Frequency's a B because white doesn't have to play the Queen's Gambit, and in fact, most of the time at the beginner level, I believe white will play the London opening, which I mentioned in my previous opening instead, and of course the Slav is not playable against that. However, the Slav is very solid against the Queen's Gambit. I've played against it many, many times in tournaments, and it's very, very decent. So if you want to pick it up, certainly it's a very solid option as a specific line to fight against the Queen's Gambit. And so that's going to round out our B category. And now we're going to move on to A ranked openings. The A tier is reserved for openings that are very, very good starting points for new players. They're better than all of the other openings that we've listed so far for various reasons. They're usually extremely solid, fairly easy to pick up, and also will be very easy positions to get into. They don't require your opponent to play a specific order of moves a specific number of times. And so the first one we're going to go over is going to be the Caro-Kann, which now goes e4, c6, d4, d5. And the main idea is, of course, that black would like for white to take on d5 and then get to exchange their side c-pawn for the central e-pawn. And that's a very good idea. And it has the advantage over the French of, well, if white plays e5 here, black does not have to lock in their bishop. They can instead move the bishop out to f5. And so what Caro-Kann players will end up with is a French position where their bishop is not a French bishop, so to speak. It is not a weak bishop that is going to be trapped in by its own pawns. Rather, it's a fairly active one out here. Now, there are still some problems and some things that you have to be aware of as a Caro-Kann player. It is a very solid opening, but you do have to be aware of some tricks and traps. For example, the tall variation now h4 seeks to trap black's bishop, and black must immediately react to this, usually by moving the h-pawn. Other things that can happen, the fantasy variation with the Caro-Kann, where white tries to hold on to the center. You do have to know what to do. However, it's not too hard to learn these lines. For example, for the fantasy variation, the main line that is easy to play for black is d takes e4, f takes e4, e5, and utilizing this line of sight and immediately striking in the center against white's pawns. So it's not too hard to learn. I have multiple friends who play this. It's extremely, extremely solid, and it's quite a decent starting point as an answer to e4. Also in A tier against e4 is going to be the Petrov defense, which goes e4, e5. And now after knight f3, instead of defending the pawn on e5, which most openings do, the Petrov defense takes exception to that by counterattacking with knight f6, sort of playing copycat in some sense and attacking white's pawn on e4. Now, of course, the idea after knight takes e5 is not to take on e4, because there is the big problem of queen e2, and now we have some potential problems. For example, the knight moves, there's knight c6, attacking black's queen while also giving check. And of course, black cannot properly hold on to the knight uh, with something like d5 because white is simply going to take it away. That said, uh, the main idea of the Petrov is instead to play d6, kick out the knight first, and then take afterward, since now after queen e2, for example, black can respond with queen e7 and a queen trade if white so desires. As a result, the Petrov is extremely solid, although it is also known to be a little bit boring. If you want to spice up your Petrov, there is also the option to play the Stafford Gambit, popularized, of course, by Eric Rosen, where after knight takes c5, there is now knight c6, trying to gambit a pawn. And if you want to learn about the Stafford, you can go to I am Eric Rosen's videos. I am, of course, being international master. But of course, for the Petrov defense, for a solidity rating of A, you should really be playing d6. And this is extremely solid. Black is going to play fairly well here. And as for the worries about black having a bad bishop, will be because of course after let's say knight f6, knight takes e4, d4, or sorry, pawn to d4, black can now play d5, and the bishop is active again. So unlike let's say the Philidor defense, which had that problem, the Petrov defense has no such problem and retains the same stability of the Philidor while not having the crippling weakness of a bad bishop. Next up in A tier, also a response to e4, is going to be the Scandinavian defense. So white is going to start with e4, and now d5 is the Scandinavian defense, which is the most forceful move, immediately challenging the pawn on e4. And of course, now the idea is uh, there's only really two responses, e5 and e takes d5. e5 is not very good. Black can play bishop f5 here, and achieve a situation very similar to the Caro-Kann, with the bishop out of the pawn formation. And unlike the Caro-Kann, black doesn't waste a move going c6. Black can immediately play c5 on the next turn if they so choose. And so this is even better for black than the Caro-Kann is. And so, of course, white's real response is to play e takes d5, after which black has a multitude of options, the main ones being knight f6 and queen takes d5, and both are reasonable. My main suggestion would be knight f6, attacking this pawn, as of course after queen takes d5, immediately white has the response knight c3, attacking queen and developing a piece. And so, of course, I prefer knight f6, knight f6, with the idea of capturing the pawn with the knight instead of the queen. And you might be wondering, well, what about c4? Doesn't that save the pawn? Well, actually, that's a bait. Black would love to see c4 because now we have the Scandinavian gambit with pawn to c6. Then after d takes c6, knight takes c6, black actually is the one with the advantage due to control over the d4 square as well as the as well as the e5 square. Supremely ahead development, and of course, white's bishop on f1 now has nowhere to go. Try and challenge this knight on c6, and black is going to have a very good time here. So the Scandinavian defense is going to get a B for solidity, just because after white's best response, which is e4, d5, e takes d5, knight f6, and now d4, trying to give the pawn back, knight takes d5, c4, knight f6, now results with white having a slightly better center than black, but this is still very playable for black, and a lot of the Scandinavian defense comes down to just playing by the principles of the game, which is why it's very easy to learn, and it's also very forceful since you immediately force white to decide what they're going to do with that e4 pawn on the second turn with pawn to d5, which is why frequency is an A. And our final A tier opening, which is going to be our best A tier opening with 3 A's all across the board, is going to be the Sicilian. And more specific than that, it's not just the Sicilian, it's specifically the dragon variation of the Sicilian, which goes e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, which is the open Sicilian, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, d6, I believe it's now bishop e3, and now g6, with the idea, and this is why it's called the dragon, of putting the bishop on the g7 square where it will be able to look down a very long dark diagonal. And with all of those moves, you might be wondering, wait, how is this a learnability or frequency of A? Well, it's because white can't really stop this that much. So after e4, c5, there's not much that white can do to stop you from fianchettoing the bishop. If they choose to play d3, for example, you can always still play g6 and bishop g7, and then play out the other moves later. There's no way for them to really stop you from doing that, except for really b3, but most people don't really play that because the bishop really would prefer to be on e3 instead. And, the close Sicilian doesn't stop it, the Grand Prix doesn't stop it, you can most certainly still play it. And I will note, I am recommending the standard Sicilian Dragon over the accelerated or hyper accelerated, which, for example, uh, after here, g6 would be the hyper accelerated dragon, which has some problems, mainly with regards to uh, The one that's relevant at the beginner level is d4, c takes d4, queen takes d4, and now you have some problems here because you cannot play bishop g7, and after knight f6, there is e5 with some complications. At the higher up level, you're going to run into the Marzi bind instead. So after, let's say, takes, you're going to run into the Marzi bind, which is after bishop g7, for example, you have c4. And yeah, that's going to be a problem. Whereas if you stay to the traditional line, so that is the standard Sicilian dragon line with e4, c5, and now we have, sorry, knight f3, knight c6, d4 captures. Knight f6 is going to force white to play knight c3, and so you do not have the Marazzi bind anymore, and you don't have the problem of white getting this very powerful control of d5, and after d6, you also don't have to worry about any e5 pushes anymore. And so you can more safely play g6 and bishop g7. And so that's the final opening in A tier. But wait, just like last time, we've got one more opening, and we're going to put in S tier. And that is, drumroll please, the King's Indian defense alongside the Perk defense. So what is this? Why am I putting two openings alongside each other? Well, they're actually very similar, and the only difference is what white does, not what black does. Black does the same thing in both openings. So what are these? Well, let's start with the King's Indian defense. Or rather, let's start with the setup, I should say. The setup for black is going to be the same every single time. The pawn goes to d6, black's other pawn goes to g6, and then black develops a knight to f6, a bishop g7, castles quickly, and then my suggestion is going to be knight d7. So let's see how this plays out. First, let's start with the King's Indian variation. The King's Indian specifically is when white moves the pawn to c4. So, for example, d4, d6, and now white plays c4, g6, e4, knight f6, knight c3, bishop g7. Now let's say the same-ish variation of f3. Now we have castles for black, bishop e3, and now my suggested move would be knight d7. This is a King's Indian defense. Why? Because white has a pawn on c4. Okay, what if they don't? Then it's considered a perk. So if we go back, instead of c4, after d4, d6, let's say white played e4 immediately, and then after e4, g6, let's say something like f4, knight f6, knight c3, bishop g7, knight f3, castle kingside, and bishop d3, and knight d7. Now this would be a perk defense. It's really no different for black either way. The only difference, of course, is what white is playing in response, and that's why I'm putting them next to each other. Regardless, the main general name for this is the King's Indian, because you're moving the pawn up on g6 and the bishop to g7, which is a fianchetto on the king's side. And it's called Indian because it has a fianchetto in it. So it's the king's side fianchetto, and therefore it's called the King's Indian defense. So let's look at it from the King's Indian variation to get a general idea of why I'm recommending it. So c4, g6, e4, knight f6, knight f3, bishop g7, f6, castles, bishop e3, and now knight d7. There are multiple ways to play the King's Indian, of course, but of course, I'm going to suggest knight d7. Some other ways are knight c6 and e5, for example, or sometimes even sacrificing with c5 immediately. But I'm going to recommend knight d7. And now there are two ideas for black, one of which is to push on c5, and the other is to push on e5. And depending on whether white castles kingside, in which case you play e5, or white castles queenside, in which case you play c5. But basically, the general idea is to strike back in the center. So unlike something like the French, or the Philidor, where you get very, very passive very, very early, and then don't get a chance to strike back in the center very efficiently, here you definitely do. Both of these pawn pushes are very good against white and are going to take back a lot of space and create a lot of chaos. And the general idea is to strike back. So let's say with c5 here, and then push on the side that you strike on. So if you push on c5, you're going to play a6, b5, and push over the queen side, sometimes even sacrificing a pawn there. If the push is e5, and you're going to move this knight out of the way and then push f5. You can move it in any particular direction and prepare the push however you want. Push f5 and f4 to launch an attack on the king side. And this flexibility in game plan, as well as the ease of setup, where you can just move your pieces to these squares every single game, is what gives this opening a learnability of A and a frequency of A for me. As for solidity, while yes, the computer will say this is slightly worse for black, that's generally true of black openings to begin with. And while black does give away a lot of space, black is going to be able to get it back. And tactically speaking, it is extremely, extremely difficult for white to demonstrate any sort of advantage, since the computer typically anyway has a hard time evaluating closed positions, which is what often happens in the King's Indian defense uh, as slash perk. And so I'm still going to give this a solidity of A because even at the 2000s or so level, there's really no refutation to the King's Indian defense. King's Indian defense being slightly better for white is only really ever seen at the GM level. And so relative to the beginner level, I'm going to give this a solidity of A. There's no line that white can ever memorize to really try and prove the advantage of that the computer states that white has in the King's Indian. And so that's it. King's Indian and Kirk are my S tier recommendations for what to learn as black. And if you want to see the full tier list, well, here it is. These are all the openings I went over in this video. So again, uh, if you wanted to see an opening reviewed that I didn't go over, please feel free, leave a comment down below. I will, as quickly as possible, reply to you with what I believe should be the rating for that opening. Or if you disagreed with an opening ranking, do feel to let me know as well. Feel free to let me know as well. And with that, thank you all for watching, and we'll probably be resuming more standard lectures in the next video. See you all next time.